he basically does a lot of he's like Second Thought almost. You know what I mean? He does a lot of this stuff, but more historical. He's like a historical Second Thought. And obviously, you guys know I love Second Thought. So let's watch. I already told him earlier. His TikTok is literally all golden content. I'm actually kind of surprised he hasn't been banned. I mean, I hope he never does, because I don't think he does anything that's like totally unacceptable from the terms of service standpoint. But he's great.
On December 7th, 1981, 45-year-old James Von Brunn entered the headquarters of the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C.
I've helped him with not getting banned. Nice.
After writing his name on the sign-in sheet, Von Brunn explained to a security guard that he was a photographer intending to take pictures of the boardroom inside. After being told he'd have to wait, Von Brunn sprinted up the staircase, and the security guard swiftly
I didn't know this
him.
shit.
Von Brunn was then met by another guard in a corridor and promptly pulled out a sawed-off shotgun. Before he could pull the trigger, Von Brunn was overpowered. In a bag slung over his shoulder, security recovered a .38 caliber revolver and a hunting knife. He then claimed to have planted a bomb in the building, which turned out to be a hoax, leading to the building
not
being
JCS.
evacuated. He said he was distraught over high interest rates and the state of the economy. Driving throughout the U.S., through its countryside and urban areas, through cities and towns big and small, the corpses of industry litter the landscape. Abandoned factories, plants, and yards are reduced to overgrown and decaying structures. Whole towns and cities have been gutted by the void, causing a mass exodus of working-class communities. The factories that sustain the lives of millions of families...
By the way, this is going to trigger every neoliberal, because they will say that it's not actually Carter that was responsible for the increase in interest rates, but also at the same time, interest rates increasing was not necessarily bad. So I'm just letting you know, trigger warning for all the neoliberal Andes in the chat. You are going to get very angry at this video. Is this guy conservative or anti-liberal? No, he's not. He's not a conservative. He is anti-liberal, but he's not conservative.
Were not killed off by
Sushi
the gradual
kebab guy, thank you for the
and
10 of the sub.
process of neoliberalism or Reaganomics, but by a deliberate policy exacted on the economy all at once.
Yeah, the famous Gaddafi supporting conservative. Actually, to be fair, Gaddafi is such a mishmash of like different kinds of politics that in sometimes was like very self-serving, and in other times was so incredibly fucking unhinged that like you could technically have some conservative Gaddafi fans. So I don't know, I guess.
Indeed, Ronald Reagan has been a convenient scapegoat for liberals to unload all of the ills of the economy onto. And while his fiscal policies have set the stage for deregulation and cuts to social spending, causing a massive wealth redistribution to the upper crust, it is the monetary policy from just before his presidency which set the stage for the 1980s. The American post-war boom brought unprecedented prosperity. Millions of families became homeowners. The government subsidized cutting-edge industries that added to their global hegemony. But, of course, the side effect of a booming economy is inflation. The Federal Reserve is in the position of the chaperone who has ordered the punch bowl removed just when the party was really warming up. Inflation had become out of control in the 1970s, and by 1980, the Consumer Price Index showed an annual inflation increase of 13.5%, the highest it's ever been. President Jimmy Carter was sandbagged for the state of the economy, and therefore inflation was the Democratic Party's cross to bear. Carter made the decision to shake up monetary policy in a dramatic way, and would appoint a towering figure, both metaphorically and literally, as he stood at 6'7", one of the most influential Federal Reserve chairs in its history, Paul Adolph Volcker Jr. Paul Volcker would be chosen to be the executioner of the economy, and the Federal Reserve marched in lockstep with big banks to achieve that.
By the way, speaking of which, one of the deflationary mechanisms that Nixon implemented at the time, which is so interesting to think about, called the Nixon shock, is something that like is almost entirely unimaginable now. He's probably not going to get into that right here because he's talking about like the Democrats and the Democrat appointed individuals and their neoliberal economics and their like neoliberal policies that actually eviscerated the American economy. But regardless, I want to talk about the Nixon shock, and not the top of the hour ad break. You know, that's not what I'm talking about. Obviously, that's shocking to you if you're new here. You're like, what? A 3-minute ad break at the top of the hour? Yes, That is what's going on. At the top of the hour, there's a 3-minute ad break. Don't be fooled, though. You can avoid those ads as long as you subscribe for $5 or for free. Okay? Even if you were shocked, you can avoid those ads by subscribing or by getting gifted a sub. Here's the 3-minute ad break now. Sushi Kebab Guy, once again, thank you for the 10 gifted subs, allowing 10 people to no longer see the ads at the top of the motherfucking hour. Okay? Extra Summons, thank you for the 5 gifted subs. Emakin, thank you for the 5 gifted subs as well. But yeah, the Nixon shock was a series of economic measures undertaken by the United States President Richard Nixon in 1971 in response to increasing inflation, the most significant of which were the wage and price freezes, which was a huge one, a 90-day wage and price freeze that Richard Nixon basically almost single-handedly implemented. Okay? I just played a hex on you for that doctor segue. Okay, that's mean. Please don't hex me. I am a supporter of the TikTok witches. I'm a supporter of witch talk. Okay.
Their aims. Now, this video isn't just about how private banks influence Federal Reserve policy. You'll have to watch my last Fed video for that, which is on the screen now. But just as a quick review, the Federal Reserve System consists of a board of governors in Washington and 12 reserve banks throughout the
Aren't price freezes something you advocate for considering home prices? Yes. No, I'm saying that was... It's like unimaginable that any president, let alone a conservative president, would advocate for price fixes or price fixing in any way, or a price freeze in any way, which also, like on the other hand, also came along with a wage freeze as well. He said to unions that they were not allowed to increase wages in that 90-day period, just like corporations were not allowed to increase prices.
The country. Back in 1979, the heads of the reserve banks were mostly chosen by the private banks in their districts. But what I didn't go over in my last video is the Federal Advisory Council, or FAC. Put simply, the FAC are private bankers chosen by the reserve banks who meet with the Board of Governors 4 times a year. In 1979, the FAC members included the chairman of the board of Citibank, for example. On September 7, 1979, the FAC would have one of their routine meetings. It would prove to be one of the most consequential in modern American history. According to the minutes of the meeting, the bankers urged the governors to target the amount of money in the economy rather than concerning themselves with interest rates. To achieve this, interest rates would reach their highest levels in history. This monetary theory is otherwise known as monetarism and was popularized by Milton Friedman, probably the most influential economist of the 20th century, rivaled only by John Maynard Keynes. To show how impactful this meeting was, the Board of Governors would come to the same conclusion themselves 3 weeks later. The governors would not tell the president of their decision for a month. This is legal because the Federal Reserve is not obligated to inform the president about their decisions. Indeed, neither the president nor Congress were consulted about this momentous event, and their experiment would be implemented in earnest on October 6, 1979. There wasn't any question that the board knew that recession would follow. That's the penalty you have to pay for going out too far on the inflation side. Before March 31st, 1980, there existed laws against excessive interest rates, called anti-usury laws. There was even a cap on interest rates, called an interest rate ceiling. In the post-New Deal world, when interest rates hit their ceiling, depositors withdrew their money, which forced banks to stop lending. This naturally cooled down the economy. But on March 31st, 1980, President Jimmy Carter would sign the Monetary Control Act, passed through both the Democrat-controlled Senate and Democrat-controlled House of Representatives. In an instant, lending institutions and banks could now charge any interest rate on loans that they wanted. The social implications were obvious. Borrowers, businesses, and consumers would pay higher interest rates, and creditors would enjoy higher returns on their wealth. The unregulated interest rates, coupled with the Fed's new tightening of money, would change the American landscape forever. The consequences would be far-reaching and varied. Just to put it in perspective, the federal funds rate, the most important interest rate metric, which refers to short-term interest rates between banks, is making the news now as of February 2023 for reaching its highest level in 15 years, of over 4%. By January of 1980, it would reach almost 14%. By April, it was nearly 18%. And after relenting for a brief period, the Fed would increase the Fed funds rate rapidly, up to 20% by January of 1981. What followed was the worst recession since the Great Depression. For nearly 2 years, the unemployment rate increased every single month, and by 1982, 12 million people were out of work, with millions more relegated to part-time, a total of as many as 20 million people. But the so-called dragon of inflation was slayed, and the inflation rate was curtailed to under 4%. What was the result of this? Well, the recession, as all recessions, was very profitable for banks and holders of large financial wealth, as explained in my last video about the Fed. Bankers enjoyed the high returns from loans made just before the recession and used the cheaper money from during the recession to invest and make even more money. Their cash and dollar-denominated assets started to appreciate due to low inflation, and they became extraordinarily wealthy. While construction, manufacturing, and farming took historic and permanent losses, 1981 produced more returns for banks than at any time in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s. And what did the banks do with all this wealth? Surely they invested it responsibly and carefully. Actually, they started loaning it to underdeveloped countries. To paint a picture of just how reckless and brazen American bankers had become, 9 of the largest U.S. banks' risk exposure, meaning the amount loaned compared to their capital, was over 200%. This meant that if a country defaulted on a loan, the loss would wipe out more than 2 times the money that the bank had on hand. For the poor countries, what economists call least developed countries, or LDCs, things became very bad during the recession. For starters, the Federal Reserve raising interest rates raised them around the globe, so countries had to pay more for their debt. But on top of that, they lost their most important export market, the United States. The lack of demand created what is now known as the LDC debt crisis. The Fed mobilized to facilitate currency swaps, swapping currencies with countries, giving them much-needed dollars to back up their economies. This bided them enough time before the IMF would enter the equation. Starting with Mexico, the IMF would loan money to roughly 15 countries, culminating in the beginning of the era of the Structural Adjustment Program, or SAPs. SAPs were how the IMF would apply conditions to loans that included cruel austerity measures, including privatizing industries causing mass layoffs, suspension of price controls, wage cuts, and cuts to welfare programs in already miserably poor countries. These countries' budgets would be oriented toward paying back loans, which became
I've explained this in very reductive terms multiple times over when I talk about like debtor imperialism that America and the Western world has utilized time and time again on the global South, where they basically lend you money, okay, and then they tell you if you want this money, obviously, you have to buy from our corporations, and you can only use it on specific things, and if you want to turn around and, like, I don't know, help prosper your nation through social spending, you can't do that. You're not allowed.
Impossible given the high interest rates, which compounded, creating a larger balance sheet for them to pay every year. This virtual Ponzi game would increase the debt burden for years to come. According to the World Bank, another partner in the destruction of developing economies...
So why take that loan? What do you mean? They got nothing. Why take that loan is such a funny question to ask. I wonder why nations of the global South would take any kind of loans from the Western world. I wonder what could possibly be the reason. I don't know. Maybe because they were held back deliberately through like direct violence, not the indirect violence of like imperialism by a different name, but the direct violence of colonialism, colonization.
In 1982, the Caribbean and South America owed $330 billion in debt. By 1984, they owed $374 billion. As is widely known today, developing economies have never recovered from the sweeping neoliberal reforms.
Yeah, Turkish people are permanently traumatized by the IMF, one of the biggest reasons why Erdogan was elected in the first place, yeah.
The era of the Structural Adjustment Program. Over in America, unemployment reached 11%. Most of them were concentrated in the industrial sector, construction, mining, manufacturing. In fact, 23% of the automobile industry was unemployed, as well as 29% of miners and 22% of construction workers. Typically in periods of economic downturn and mass layoffs, the economy would pick back up and industrial workers were able to enter the job market once again. But in the 1980s, the manufacturing and industrial sector withered away and died for good. There's a reason for that. To many Americans, the idea of devaluing the dollar sounds like a bad thing, even vaguely unpatriotic perhaps. A weak dollar must weaken our mighty nation. A strong dollar means a strong economy. You would probably be surprised to learn that the strong dollar is, more than any...
The CCP did the same thing with the Sri Lankan ports and is currently trying to do it again with countries in Africa. That is an assessment that is not shared by even neoliberals. Even the Foreign Policy magazine disagrees with your assessment. The countries certainly disagree with it because they take those loans. But the conditions implemented with Chinese loans, as far as I understand, one, have way better terms and conditions for those leaders, and two, do not come with austerity measures, like forcible austerity measures. So the Chinese conditions, it seems, as far as, up until today, Chinese loan conditions have been much more favorable than Western loans that they've gotten. For the record, it is so glaringly obvious. It's that much is so obvious that the Atlantic and the Foreign Policy magazine have even openly admitted that it's wrong. Like, look at this. China cancels 23 loans to Africa amid the debt trap debate. This is from Voice of America. Like, when the Atlantic and Western media outlets that absolutely despise China and will use everything they can to shit on China are basically stating that, and the CIA itself, like its propaganda arm of the State Department itself, is openly admitting that the Chinese debt trap is infinitely more favorable. Like, this is the State Department openly admitting this. I don't know what to tell you. A solid 90% of what the West accuses China of doing is simply Western projection. A big example I can think of the U.S. calling China over-policed when the U.S. is a quarter of the world's prison population. Yes, that is real. That is very real. The very glaringly obvious, stupid fucking statement that America constantly points the finger at others over. What is this? Oh, this is an entire fucking, Jesus Christ. Look at this Twitter thread, dude. Holy shit. Talking about the Chinese debt trap. Bidet marksman. As a result of China's rise for the first time since the fall of the USSR, there exists a pathway for countries to truly develop that doesn't require a choice between complete subservience to foreign capital or brutal isolation and attack. We found that China has restructured or refinanced approximately $15 billion worth of debt in Africa between 2000 and 2019. We found no asset seizures, and despite contract clauses requiring arbitration, no evidence of the use of courts to enforce payments or application of penalty interest rates. Now, I'll just say this, though. However, this is why I always say, thus far, okay? I always tell you that the Chinese loan conditions are demonstrably better than IMF loans and do not come with the same kind of like austerity measure implementations thus far. That might change in the future. That might be worse in the future. But so far, it is significantly better. Okay? So much so that like Western outlets have openly talked about how the Chinese debt trap, in the same way that the IMF has engaged in, has been not real. So, are there still corrupt officials at the tippy top pocketing some of the funds or playing favorites with the way that they distribute those funds? Absolutely. Okay? Was that a major problem with IMF loans? Absolutely. Corruption still very much exists in these countries. We are simply talking about the Chinese involvement. We're simply talking about Chinese loans in comparison to IMF loans. And from that front, Yes, the Chinese loans are demonstrably better. Okay? Now, is China, other than this, is China also utilizing these loans to curry favor with the global South? Of course they are. Okay? They're doing debtor diplomacy, if you want to call it that. Are they also sending a lot of Chinese nationals to these nations? They're also absolutely doing that. Will that lead to issues down the line? Perhaps. Okay? It's all about what China does with the power that it's developed as a global leader. That will change the game. Okay? So I'm not going to sit here and say it's all good. But with respect to what has happened historically and in contemporary society, in African nations specifically, with their involvement with the West, going from centuries of colonial exploitation and direct acts of violence to debt trap diplomacy and austerity measures implemented in these countries, to still, in some instances, owning like the colonial, some of the colonial exploits being like literally owning their fucking banks. Controlling their central banks and what they can do, like that level of direct involvement. It's certainly infinitely better than that. Yes, evil American order has decreased extreme global poverty from 38% in 1990 to 8% in 2019. Only a 78% decrease since America became the unipolar power. That's really interesting that the neoliberal Faustini had chimed in while we are currently talking about China. Okay. Which is the only reason why extreme global poverty, which, by the way, is a metric that has been massaged so much so that it's like literally laughable. Faustini, come on, tell us what extreme poverty is. Give us the dollar value of what extreme poverty is. Come on, you're a big boy. You know this. You know what happened. You know how extreme poverty has been eviscerated, partially as a consequence of what the extreme poverty dollar value is. Okay, which is infinitely lower than what it's supposed to be, and partially because of China. Without like Chinese prosperity over the course of the years that Faustini is referencing, there is no evisceration of extreme poverty. None. The notion that America has eviscerated extreme global poverty is a laughable one. It's not true. Under $275 a day, but who opened Chinese economy back to the West? Oh, we have a dentist in our ranks, I think. China did not eviscerate extreme global poverty because it simply utilized its labor power. China eviscerated extreme global poverty within China because of its social spending. Okay? If you socialize the many benefits of opening up your labor market to hungry Western capitalists, and then you centrally plan and grow with the many benefits, you get something like China, a wonderful example of what a country can do. That's it. You mean Nixon? Western money came into the economy because of Nixon, which directly moved the well from America to China. The other side of the conversation, we're currently looking at the American impact of it. But yes, the other side of the conversation is China eradicating poverty internally. Saying that it's simply just Nixon, saying that it's simply, first of all, he's not wrong. But, no, guys. I mean, he's not wrong. Faustini is silly, and he's a silly neoliberal, but he's not wrong. Yes. Nixon did play a role in this, normalizing relations with China. He's not wrong about that. He was a based Maoist, third worldist. But to act like it was, out of the kindness of his heart is so fucking stupid. Yeah, poverty famously doesn't exist in China, lol. We live in the richest nation on the planet, and poverty exists here. What makes you think that poverty, of course, is not going to exist in China? I never said that China does not. I never said that China does not currently have any poverty. I simply stated that the numbers that America tries to fucking claim actually eviscerated poverty are directly in the hands of China. And that is not a consequence of China doing trade with America. It's a consequence of what you do with the profits. What China did was basically throw their labor force at the problem, throw their labor force at the problem, and eviscerate extreme poverty internally in their country through social spending. That's it. It's the socialization and the actual expenditures, not leaving all of that wealth accumulation at the tippy top, that made it so that China could eviscerate the supposedly global extreme poverty rate. Okay? But because China is such a massive country, at the time, the largest country on the planet, their numbers, when they were able to eviscerate extreme poverty at the global level, it had global implications. You understand? To turn around and say, oh, it's only because America did this is a stupid one. China could have behaved like the United States of America. China could have behaved like India. Okay? And even India, in comparison to America, still has a much more open-minded approach to socialization. You literally said eradicate poverty internally. Yes, but its implications were global because China is massive. And that money came from a Western capital, right? It's not the only factor, but it's key. Yes. But I think what you're failing to understand here is that this is not a zero-sum game. Okay? It's not a zero-sum game. What you're failing to comprehend for some reason is that, one, nobody did trade out of the kindness of their hearts, but they could have. Okay? Imagine a world in which it didn't have to take the Chinese labor force eviscerating itself, okay, annihilating itself in an effort to improve Chinese prosperity overall. But we can't do that because someone has to make profits. And those who made profits in that were the capital owners, which moved manufacturing overseas. I can tolerate lip takes, but this is downright disgusting, claiming the world benefited all. Multiple countries have been leveled and annihilated by the USA, as well as no one can afford shit. Now, even worse than 10 years ago when no one could afford shit even back then. God, what a brain dead Libertega. Billionaires are doing good. People / humans are not. Yeah. It is what it is. You gotta...
Anything else, the primary cause of the decimation of American manufacturing. This isn't a secret to economists and the board members of the Federal Reserve. The correlation between a strong dollar and weakening
Burnage 9801. Refusing to cover Israel protests reaching over 300K in Tel Aviv because it doesn't fit your narrative. What narrative? What? You okay? Dude, take your medication. Take your medication. Take your medication. Take your medication.
Economy is well known. After the 2008 crash, the Fed governors and presidents discussed at their meetings how they were going to stimulate the economy. I won't go into quantitative easing in this video, that will be the subject of a future project, but in discussing their plan, the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank president spoke earnestly about their goals. Another desired benefit is to devalue the dollar to stimulate demand for our exports, and I don't think we should be saying that publicly. Put simply, when the dollar is worth less compared to other currencies, American goods become cheaper. So those exporting agricultural products, for example, are able to find buyers who will take advantage of cheap American goods. This means more economic output, more jobs. The opposite happens when the dollar is too high. Foreign imports, like Japanese cars for example, have a competitive edge, and American producers and workers suffer as a result. Not only Americans, developing countries holding debt, which is paid back in dollars, have a heavier burden as well. In this way, the consequences span far and wide. Even the president of the New York Federal Reserve candidly admitted as much. We are decimating our export industries. Volker and I are extremely concerned about the long-term effects of the strong dollar. The rising dollar was caused by the high interest rates, which were higher than interest rates in other countries. Martin Feldstein, the Harvard economist and chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, would agree. The fall in exports and the rise in imports that result from the stronger dollar are clearly causing unemployment and threatening individual firms with possible bankruptcy. The establishment economists knew better than anyone else what was going on. Even the architect of the operation, Fed Chairman Paul Volcker, relented that the dollar was a big mistake. I kept worrying about the dollar coming down with a thud, but by late summer of 1984, it became apparent that this was taking starch out of manufacturing. And that's putting it lightly. Jobs were extinguished, many of them high-wage unionized jobs. The destruction of the dollar was permanent. The high interest rates, the dollar, the unemployment, the outsourcing all created a perfect storm, a sinister marriage of high interest rates and depressed wages. For the first time since World War II, the percentage of American families that owned their homes decreased. To quote William Greider, the old would lend their...
I love this. Was it not because of immigrants? Yeah, no, dude, totally. Yeah. Once again, immigration has never been and never will be a problem, okay? It's when you have a two-tiered immigration structure that it becomes a problem. If immigrants are allowed to enter the workforce in the same exact way that natural-born U.S. citizens are able to, where they have the same set of rights, they can unionize and ask for a larger piece of the profits that they are accumulating, profits that they're generating, then there would be no issue. The idea that there is only a finite amount of jobs that are available, okay, to everyone, and therefore adding immigrants into that labor pool is actually hurting wages or depressing wages is laughable, incorrect, and I think disproven in like the 17th century, if I'm not mistaken. The only issue is that immigration in this country, since the Chinese Exclusionary Act, has been utilized as another way to depress wages, because it currently can depress wages, okay? Has been utilized as a way to literally fucking depress wages by having a constantly refreshing new pool of labor, okay, that will work much, much cheaper than the natural born U.S. citizens, and way worse. Was it not because of immigrants? Wait, I'm joking. I know it's not because of immigrants. Oh, sorry. Well, it's a good educational moment regardless for a lot of people to understand, because most people don't recognize this. They literally think that immigrants are taking our jobs. No. Immigrant labor is not supposed to decrease or depress wages, okay? The only reason why it currently does is because there's a two-tier immigration structure, there's a two-tier labor structure in this country, a permanent underclass. And if it wasn't immigrants, it's also prison labor, slave labor within our carceral structure, both of which America actually happily employs on a regular basis. Slavery never went away in the United States of America. It just kind of changed its vibes a little bit. One guide by sarcasm, and then so fucking we're going to keep cooking. This is why I watch the stream. I mean, it's an important thing that people should understand. You know? It's very, very important for people to understand. This is like one of the fundamental, most misunderstood aspects of the American economy.
Money to the young at higher prices than ever before. Young families forming in the 1980s, setting out to buy a car or their first home, would confront credit terms and interest rates that would have terrified their parents. Double-digit mortgages and floating rates that left them vulnerable to default. Homeownership, the central component of what was described as the American dream, would gradually shrink among the population, most dramatically among younger families. In one fell swoop, the decision to pass the Monetary Control Act in 1980 proved to be a fatal blow to the idea of a stable income, being able to live securely in America, owning...
Yeah, the Democratic Party with its avid support for neoliberal economics have been a destructive force from Carter to Bill Clinton to even Barack Obama. They have been more tempered in recent years, I would say. Like, in comparison to prior Democrats of the fucking 90s, especially, holy shit, dude. I mean, our Democrats now kind of look like socialists with respect to how awful those very same Democrats were at the same exact period in time. So, like, just remember that, like, whenever people say, like, oh, Democrats are the party of the working class, blah, 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 like, there's a serious disdain for the Democratic Party for this reason. Like, Bill Clinton's awful anti-welfare policies, holy fuck, dude, just straight up ruined so many benefits in this country. The repealing of the Glass-Steagall is another reason why banks are, again, a destructive force on the American economy all the time. Meanwhile, we just always keep bailing out the executives and the actual people who receive those profits under the guise of, like, fixing the U.S. economy. and it doesn't seem to change at all. It's just their power seems endless, and it's always growing. The amount of wealth that they can accumulate seems endless and is always growing. Dodd-Frank and Glass-Steagall have had detrimental effects on the middle class. What do you mean? Like, oh, you mean the repealing of both of those things, not like the actual acts itself.
Your own home and having wages reliably protected by strong unions. Democrats did this. To the enthusiasm of Republicans, no doubt, and the encouragement of Republican thinkers, namely Milton Friedman and Republican President Ronald Reagan. The economic legacy of the Democratic Party is merely a synthesis with the right to adopt conservative money policies. Democrats used their power to implement policies which were the brainchild of Milton Friedman. Democrats did the bidding of the right. This should be taught and remembered.
Yeah. I actually, neoliberals would probably look at this video and go, no, actually, he's right. And it's actually very good that Carter did this. It wasn't even like, it just depends on what your perspective is. But like, yes, even No Opinion, who is, the neoliberalism enjoyer / defender, has talked about Carter as the great deregulator, like even before Ronald Reagan, which is true. That's part of the reason why Felix Biederman absolutely despises Carter.
I need your help. This channel relies on donations and patrons. YouTube hardly monetizes my videos. I am humbly asking those who have the means to consider giving me a donation. I have a link for donations in the description right now.